Hi, my name is Philip Tite. I am a lecturer in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Seattle University. I am also an affiliate lecturer at the University of Washington in the Comparative Religion program here in Seattle. I hold a PhD degree in Religious Studies from McGill University, completed in 2005, and with a specialization in New Testament and early Christian literature. My area of focus is largely falls outside of the New Testament, though I do work in the New Testament. I'm far more interested in the material that's what would be non-canonical, or what might be called apocryphal writings. And I think that's mainly because most of that material is overlooked by scholars and doesn't get as much attention as this material in the New Testament. So I really enjoy studying that material and shedding some light on that, or hoping to shed light on that and bringing that into the broader story of early Christianity. I've written 4 books and co-edited another book. My books include a compositional rhetorical analysis of 1 Peter. It includes a work on peace and violence in the New Testament. Also, my doctoral thesis revised into a book looking at Valentinian Gnosticism and the role of moral exhortation as social rhetoric within that particular movement from the 2nd to 4th century. And my co-edited book with a colleague of mine on the East Coast, Brian Rennie, looks at religious violence. My most recent book, which you can see here, from 2012, looks at the Apocryphal Epistle to the Laodiceans. And this is, I believe, the only monograph that's actually been published on Laodiceans in modern times. And it attempts to challenge scholarly approaches to this text and to offer a fresh and more positive view of this particular early Christian letter. The Apocryphal Epistle to the Laodiceans is a short little Latin letter of about 20 verses, produced probably in the 2nd or 3rd century, in the name of Paul. And it's typically it's viewed and dismissed by scholars. It's treated in one of 2 major ways, the scholarly approach to Laodiceans. The first is what I call the dismissive approach, where the letter, and this is the most common approach, where the letter is basically seen as nothing more than a crass forgery based upon Philippians and Galatians, where the forger has basically gone into Paul's actual letters and has grabbed a whole bunch of verses and woven them together to create some random letter with no form or structure, no theological contribution to make, and its only real function is to fill in the gap that's been left by Colossians 4:16, where we read that, Paul or whoever wrote that letter indicates that there was a letter from Laodicea. And so people are like, well, where's this lost letter of Paul? And so the letter is generally just dismissed in scholarship as unworthy of our attention, or it's reduced just to simply a footnote. The second approach to Laodiceans is what I call the derivative value approach, where scholars go in and they basically say, okay, well, the letter in and of itself is not really worth very much, but it might be useful in some other study. This came out, or the most famous example of this would be the famous church historian from over a century ago, Adolf von Honeck, who used the letter to connect to the Marcionite movement, which flourished in the 2nd into the 3rd century. And that was picked up by Gil Quispel in the 1950s, who supported his reading of that text, that this was, in effect, a letter written within the Marcionite church. And that's largely based upon a reference to a letter to the Laodiceans in the Muratorian canon which was probably compiled, written somewhere around 200 CE. That also refers to a letter of Paul's to the Alexandrians, a pseudo-epigraphic letter, a letter written in Paul's name, falsely. The other, and Harnack's Marcionite reading of the text has largely been rejected in scholarship. There have been other approaches, though. A recent doctoral thesis used the letter saying, okay, well, it's obviously a pseudo-epigraphic letter. Can we use this now to assess the authenticity of the disputed letters, specifically Colossians and Ephesians? And this particular scholar used Laodiceans as kind of a measuring rod to test whether or not Colossians and Ephesians were authentic or not. And of course the author's view was, yes, it is authentic. And that was the presuppositional bias driving that scholarship. But Laodiceans was not important. What was actually important was understanding Colossians and Ephesians. Another approach has been a debate in the 1990s between Sellew and Holloway in the pages of Harvard Theological Review over whether or not Philippians is one letter or a composite letter. And the partition theory argued by Sellew was to basically say, look, Laodiceans, which is derived from Philippians, only shows indications of knowledge of certain parts of Philippians, which would fall into what might be called letter B. And Holloway responded, arguing the opposite position. So again, the letter is not important except for some other study that the scholar is interested in. In my own work on Laodiceans, I try to challenge that by saying, no, the letter actually has an internal structure, it has a purpose. It is a pseudo-epigraphic letter from the 2nd century, but it actually has a purpose. And we can actually go into this letter, we can study it, and we can actually start to analyze it. And what I did was I basically tried to do an epistolary analysis, looking at how are ancient letters structured, structurally and discursively, rhetorically, and specifically in how Paul's letters in the Pauline tradition are constructed and developed. And I applied that to Laodiceans in order to try to tease out the rhetorical situation and the purpose of the letter. And it's basically its fictive message. And I think I was fairly successful in that, trying to challenge the letter. And I came to the conclusion that the letter actually does have purpose, that the letter is, that it does have order to it, in the fivefold Pauline letter structure of prescript, the opening, thanksgiving, the body, middle, opening, middle, and closing, and a paranetic section, and then a letter closing. And my conclusion was that the letter is, although it is fictional and a very short letter, fits into what we could call a paranetic letter, a letter of moral exhortation, which is to encourage or to remind the recipients to continue upon a particular path that they are on. And Laodiceans does that by basically attacking or engaging the idea of false teachers or charlatans that could be disrupting the church and deriving people or away from the truth of the gospel, as it were, by pseudo-Paul's understanding of that. And so the letter actually does work. In going into the letter also, I looked at, well, no, why is the letter actually important? What does it actually offer us that other texts don't? And basically I came to the conclusion that, yes, it doesn't really give us much in the area of theology. It does have an ecclesiology, it does have a Christology, it does have a Trinitarian theology, all that kind of stuff. But it's not unpacked, it's not really developed like in some of the other texts. It doesn't really get heavily into the debates over heresy. It doesn't get into arguments about different sectarian groups and so forth. And it doesn't really get into offering a lot of practical advice as far as church structure or whatever, or social organizations and so on. So what is the letter actually useful for as a product of second century Pauline Christianity? Well, I came to the conclusion that, what I noticed in the letter, is that the letter is constantly emphasizing Paul's relationship to the community, and that Paul's suffering serves as a model for the community to respond. So this letter, written fictionally from the first century for a second century audience, seems to me to basically appropriate and to utilize Paul as a mechanism to encourage the community to construct their identity, their Christian identity, with Paul as a focal point, to connect them to the true gospel, whatever that happens to be. The recipients may have known, we don't. Or to connect it to a universal church, a network, a Pauline network. And so I think this is an important letter because it's part of a second century ongoing discourse that was going on, where Paul's being appropriated and utilized to construct and to support what it means to be Christian, and what Christianity is. So as a product of the second century, Paul becomes a focal point for that. So how did I actually get into this project anyway? Well, believe it or not, it's been a long time project, and it goes all the way back to when I was a first-year undergraduate student at the University of Toronto back in the late 1980s, 88, 89. And I was introduced to epistolary analysis and epistolary studies, and I got very excited about the possibility of being able to actually structurally interpret and read these early Christian materials. But I'd also been introduced to all of this wonderful material that I never knew existed outside of the Bible. And I thought, wow, this is amazing stuff. You know, this is the fun stuff. And I thought, let's get into that. And so I thought, well, let's take what I've learned about studying New Testament letters and apply that to something outside of the New Testament. And so I remember, I think this is sometime in the summer of 1990, I was working on campus in the boiler room of all places, a night shift, and I took my translation of Laodiceans, which was actually from Schleiermacher's New Testament Apocrypha, and spent the night applying an epistolary analysis and a rhetorical analysis to this letter, and breaking it down and trying to figure it out. And I, against the stream of scholarship that I had read, I discovered that no, there is actually order, and there is organization, and there is meaning and purpose to this text, even as a pseudo-epigraphic work. So I got very excited by that. And I remember sharing this with one of my professors at Toronto, Peter Richardson, who is a brilliant academic and a wonderful human being, now retired, and a great encouragement for me as I moved into my career. And I remember presenting my ideas on a generic little piece of paper with all my notes on it to Peter, and Peter looked at me and with a kind of a mischievous glint in his eye just looked at me and said, "You have the strangest ideas," and I took that as encouragement, and I knew that I would return to Laodiceans at some point. But I had become distracted by other materials, wonderful areas of research that I got into during the rest of my bachelor's, my 2 masters, and my PhD program, such as my work on 1 Peter and my work in early Christian Gnosticism in particular, and method and theory in the study of religion, which is another major interest of mine. And so Laodiceans had kind of gone by the wayside until I received my author copy of a book on Paul in the ancient letter form, right here. A book edited by Stanley Porter and Sean Adams, which was published in 2010. And that book, I had been invited to write a chapter on the Pauline prescript, the opening of the letters, and its discursive functions. And so while I sat down, I read through that entire book, and loving all of the articles that were in there. And I noticed that they were planning a future volume on Paul and pseudoepigraphy. I decided to contact the editors, Professor Stanley Porter, and suggested or asked him if he'd be open to having something on Laodiceans and or maybe 3 Corinthians another pseudo-epigraphic Pauline letter from the Acts of Paul, for this volume. And he said, absolutely, that'd be great. So I got to working on this project. And after a few months of working on it, I was already up to 80 pages, and I was only about half through my project. And I'm like, this is becoming a small monograph. So I contacted Professor Porter, and I said, so this is where the project's at. Would you like an abbreviated version of this? Should I boil it down as a chapter for this book? Or would you like this as a monograph? Because I know you edit several book series. And he said, sure, I'd love both. So I'm like, okay, with that encouragement, I just went ahead and wrote the book and then did an abbreviated version. And the book came out in 2012, and kind of bringing me full circle all the way back, which I thought was really kind of cool. And it's been a fun project to work on and to get me back into epistolary analysis. Now, I had mentioned earlier about the importance of this letter. And why is it an important letter? Why should we even study a text like this? It's only 20 verses. It seems to be a copy-paste job, and a very poor one, from Paul's actual letters. I mean, if you're talking about plagiarism, you've got ancient plagiarism there, in a sense. And so why even bother? We have other things that we can read that are far more developed and more interesting. Well, I think this is a letter is worth reading. And I've mentioned already, first of all, I think most importantly, goodbye Lear. First of all, I think most importantly, it's an historical source. It's one of our sources for 2nd century Christianity and 2nd century appropriations and constructions of Paul and the utilization of Paul. And I think it is important that we work with that. Another one is that it is one of only 2 extant apocryphal letters in Paul's name that we have that are pseudo-epigraphic. And so I think that's actually really important that we do study that material. The other one is 3 Corinthians from the Acts of Paul, which includes a letter to and from Paul with a narrative framework around it. It's a delightful letter. We also know that there are other apocryphal letters written in Paul's name. The Muratorian canon refers to Alexandrians, for instance, which is we don't know anything about. It's not extant at all, and and in Clement of Alexandria, there is a reference to a letter of Paul to the Macedonians, which might be a 4th apocryphal letter that which is also not extant. Most likely that was not an actual letter, but it's just another way of referring to Philippians. So if we want to understand how Paul is being constructed in the 2nd century, then we need to look at all of our sources. I think the other aspect is the role of authorship in early Christian text. This particular document or letter doesn't show a lot of creativity in the sense of actually writing something unique, like 3 Corinthians. Okay, one scholar referred to 3 Corinthians as not Pauline because it's so different from Paul, and then flipped around and said, and Laodiceans is not Pauline because it just tries too hard to be Paul. And I think that with Laodiceans, we've got a creative dynamic that's at play here. Laodiceans is, in effect, an editor weaving the material together to create, through arrangement, an original work of authorship and an original point. So I think it is actually important. It could also be quite important for understanding the text, the textual history of Philippians, as I mentioned earlier. But I think the other reason why studying Laodiceans is worthwhile is because, well, it's just fun. It's an awesome little text, and I think it is worth studying. And I'm not the only person who actually finds this text of interest. Maybe the only person alive today. But the text actually does have a history. It was actually important and served a function within the church, various churches, for centuries. In the East, it was very quickly rejected, but in the West, in the European context, it continued to be used and incorporated into Bibles and translated and listed in canon list. And it was not until the Protestant Reformation and the Council of Trent that it was finally and definitively dismissed from from the Bible, from the New Testament. And it's at that point that it falls into disrepute. So the text has a history, and I think looking at that history is worthwhile. I think it's important. So anyway, that's me on Laodiceans, and I hope that was helpful. Thank you so much. Bye.